Thanks for watching Morning Live. Now, the Day of Reconciliation has been celebrated since 1995, just after the end of apartheid. And decades on, personal incidents of racism still make headlines in our country. And this year, Eben Catzavelos pleaded guilty to a charge of crimen injuria for a racial slur and also agreed to pay the South African Human Rights Commission 150,000 rand in fines. Now, Springbok rugby player Eben Etzebeth also made the headlines and denied allegations that he is a racist and that he used the H word during an altercation in Langebaan in the Western Cape. Now, to discuss this further, we're joined by Charlotte Motsoari, who's a psychosocial trauma professional at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation. Thanks so much for coming through.
Thank you for having me.
Well, today is Reconciliation Day, and even after the end of apartheid and generations later, we are still grappling with the issue of racism in South Africa. What drives it?
I think, you see, when it comes to racism, it's a power dynamic that's involved. It's about one race feeling that they are superior than the other race. And when you look at South Africa right now, a lot of people still have those sentiments. A lot of white people still feel superior to the other races. So you find that it's very difficult to go past racial issues in South Africa.
But why is it difficult? You know, again, what is at the root of this racism? Because we always hear the argument that racism is something that you are taught. You are not born with it. So what is it about us or our environment that sustains this?
I think when you think about it, in the wake of democracy, right, there were supposed to have been processes that were meant to curb racism and end racism and sexist views and all that. But the TRC, really, when you think about it, was more like, in my opinion, a rushed process that was kind of put together so that we can move forward. But when you think about rehabilitation in the bigger broad of the sense, there's other processes that need to be in place, reparations, truth-telling, and accountability. And I think a lot of the times, those are the things that are still missing in South Africa, and we need to really go back, retrace our steps, and go back and see how can we get a full rehabilitation of our country.
Can we do that at this stage? Because some would say it was a missed opportunity. We should have done this at the turn of democracy, around about the same time as the TRC. But where we are right now, are we still able to do that?
I think, you know, we can say that time has passed and all that, but we are here now. We can't move on the way we are moving on. I mean, with the recent, with the case we just heard now, things like this are still happening. So we cannot afford to say that time has passed. We really have to retrace, and we really have to go back and see where did we go wrong with the processes of rehabilitation. And, you know, more than just having a group of people in suits in some office deciding that this is what's going to happen for the country, going back to the people who were actually victims, direct victims of these traumas in the past, and say, back then, what did you need? What could have made things better for you at that time? And I think, I mean, we cannot afford to go forward the way we are going, because things like this are still happening. People are still tortured. People are still making videos, you know, saying the H word or the K word. So we cannot afford to say that time has passed.
So, given the process that you've outlined, you know, and again, I'm struggling with how we're going to start this process, where we're going to start it, how we're going to move it forward, because some people would say, you know, I was not part of that generation. So, you know, how does this affect me? Why should I be implicated in what my forefathers may have been guilty of? How do we start a process such as the one that you're talking about?
Well, just to go to the other question you were asking about the people that will say, I wasn't part of that. But the reality is that people are still benefiting from generations of wealth or generations of being in a certain position in society. So it's really unfair, and it's really an insult to the victims of apartheid to say things like that. And I think, as I was saying before, really going back to those people who were victims of apartheid traumas, right? And saying back then, what would have helped? What would have helped you in that case to kind of cross you over to the other side, right? And it begins with having these dialogues more and more. And people will say, oh, you need to get over it and all sorts of things. But that in itself is an insult, to the state of our country. Because we find that more and more cases like this are coming up, and we cannot go forward the way we are. So we really need to make it a priority in terms of government, making these processes a priority, having more dialogues, more truth-telling, and really honoring the victims of apartheid.
But is it a process that we should look to government to drive? Is it not something that we should now be taking ownership of as individuals, as families, in terms of the environment in which these types of attitudes are bred?
Absolutely not. So it shouldn't just be the government, because the society kind of rides the narrative of the country, right? And as you said, it starts in the families. What's the narrative of the family? What kind of conversations accompany our dinner meals? What kind of values and principles are we putting into our children? And we need to be always aware of the transgenerational trauma that is passed on from generations. Because when you look at the state of the youth, for example, the society in general is quite violent when you think about South Africa. And the youth are more often than not involved in a lot of this violence. So you have children walking around carrying traumas that they do not understand, firstly, and they do not know where this comes from. And they're inciting violence in different ways, And you think about, for example, our parents, right? They do not know how to admit already to their own pain or their own, traumas, right? So those are the people that we really need to start with. Those are the people we need to start with when you talk about this transgenerational trauma. And then moving forward, having these dialogues more often in our societies, in our schools. The race issue needs to be taught in a way that is more critical. Like, really think about how do you critically get the children to think and talk about race. When you talk about the history of South Africa, I remember you were asked about who was the first black president and so on. But we need to really go change even our whole questions to say, why do you think? Questions like, why do you think apartheid lasted so long? What made it last so long? That kind of incites more critical thinking and really imprints more on the child than just learning by rote and then they move on. But then also, as I was saying, at home, it really needs to be an ongoing conversation.
Well, Charlotte Motsoari, thanks so much. A psychosocial trauma professional at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, talking to us about issues of reconciliation in this country decades after the end of apartheid. Brings us up to 8 o'clock. It's time for the latest news with Leanne.